Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. And tonight, we're lucky to have with us Olaf Hage, and you can find Olaf's website at thetimequest.com. That's thetimequest.com. And Olaf has a lot of really interesting writings on his website, as well as tapes, very special tapes that you can order, and he'll be telling you about that later on. But right now, we're going to talk about the end of the world, Planet X. Olaf, hi, how are you tonight?
Fine, except I'm not going to be talking about the end of the world. I'm going to be talking about why Zecharia Sitchin's theory about the end of the world isn't true.
Okay. That's a plan.
Just had a big discovery, supposedly, last week of the so-called 10th planet.
Yeah.
And, you know, this has enormous implications for Zecharia Sitchin and for Nancy Leader and all of these Planet X and Nibiru people.
You mean that woman that killed her dog with her bare hands?
I don't know if they were bare hands or a shovel or she used a rope or an ice.
Oh, my God.
What she used. She just said she killed her dog and she did it herself.
I don't know how anybody in his right mind could do that.
Yes, that's the correct observation of that situation.
Oh, gosh.
And, yeah, so, I mean, there are a lot of people who have been saying that, you know, there's a Planet X, a 10th planet, another planet out there, and that it comes periodically back into the inner solar system, and this object, according to Zecharia Sitchin, is Nibiru, and Nancy Leader called it Planet X. Well, actually, she said that reptilian aliens in the star system of Zeta Reticuli told her that it was coming by in May, on May 15th, I think it was, of the year 2003, and that it was 4 times the size of the Earth, and that it was going to cause terrible destruction and disruption, and that's why she had to kill her dog. It all makes perfect sense.
Oh, yeah, right.
Anyway, of course it didn't show up. Apparently the reptilians are on the metric system, and has the same problem as JPL. But
yeah.
Whatever the difficulty is, you know, her predictions proved to be false. However, surprise, surprise, I'm getting emails from her followers who think she's still on the mark, I guess, because they're still going to her website. She's still putting up stuff. And even Coast to Coast AM is going to try to have her back on the show again.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, so Nancy Leader, I guess you could say almost any stupid thing you want. They give you 2 years to kind of disappear into the woodwork, and then you come back, and everybody's going to pretend as though you're not an idiot. Or wrong, or deluded, or lied to by reptilians, or whatever the problem was.
Yeah.
So, well, she's not an idiot, actually. She's a very bright lady, but, of course, that's one of the criteria for being whack-a-dig-hoy.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to be really insane, you've got to be pretty smart.
Yeah.
But anyway, last week we had, and by the time people may be hearing this, of course, it won't be last week anymore, but we'll just say in July of 2005, mysteriously referred to hereafter as last week,
Okay.
that there was an announcement that somebody had discovered an object that they were calling the 10th planet. And CBS Radio kind of almost practically broke in and said, there's word just in, you know, that the 10th planet has been discovered out beyond Pluto. And boy, it was really exciting at first, until I got down to the details.
Yeah.
And the details are that the 10th planet is apparently about the same size as our moon. Well,
Okay.
isn't that exciting?
Well, I don't know anything about these planets, so have at it, Olaf.
Yeah, so maybe it's not a planet after all. Maybe it's just a moon. And, we define a moon as an object that's orbiting another object that's orbiting a star.
Right.
So, objects that orbit stars are planets, provided they're big enough, because otherwise they're just debris. Or, asteroids, comets, Kuiper belt objects, Kowal objects. There's all kinds of other stuff out there.
Yeah.
But for whatever reasons, we're going to apparently call this one the 10th planet. Now, I don't understand that. It's smaller than Sedna, the object that was discovered, I guess was it last year already? And that object's about something like, I think they said something like 10 times or 100 times out farther than Pluto is from the sun. So it's way out there. And I guess if you get far enough away from the sun, even though you're still orbiting the sun, and even though you're as big as Mars, you don't count. But if you're a little bit closer, and in this case, the object has an orbit. From what I understand, it goes out as far as 100 times as far from the sun as the Earth is. I'll let that sink in for a second. And then it comes in as close as the orbit of Neptune, which is what Pluto also does. Both these objects come in to the orbit of Neptune. And in fact, back in 1989, Pluto passed inside the orbit of Neptune, which kind of raises the question as to whether maybe at one point or another Pluto might have been a moon of Neptune, because you see Pluto is smaller than our moon, so it really is a moon-sized object, whatever it is. But it's got another object orbiting it, which is, I think it's something like half the size of Pluto, so at least half the diameter, which would make it about 1/8 the mass. So we do have a great disparity in size here. Now, if you go out to the orbit of Neptune, and you've got Pluto coming in there, and you've got this new object, which I guess we ought to tell everybody what its name is. It's 2003 UB313. Is that catchy?
Oh boy, that's just an engineer had to come up with that.
I should tell us that it was actually discovered 2 years ago in 2003, not in 2005. So why did they keep it a secret? Well, they were doing some checking. You know how they like to do checking.
Yeah.
Why were they bothering to check about this and not tell us that it was there? Well, let me go back. It goes from 100 times as far from the sun as we are, out to somewhere around 20 times as far from the sun as we are, around where Neptune is. So that's a huge disparity, okay? That's a 5-to-1 ratio. That's like a comet. That's a pretty unstable orbit. That's a planet that looks like it's being drawn into the solar system. And, it's the size of, basically, it's about the size of our moon, maybe a little bit larger. It's 1.5 times the mass of Pluto, which makes it roughly 2,200, 2,300 miles in diameter. It's pretty close to the size of our moon. So we have, unless some of the data I've been looking at is going to be revised upward, downward, or sideways. But generally speaking, this is an object that is about the size of our moon, but in an orbit like a comet. But it doesn't, as they claim, come in any closer than the orbit of Neptune, which, of course, is the same problem with Pluto. Pluto's got an elliptical orbit as well, and it goes out. Actually, all the planets have elliptical orbits, but some are more elliptical than others, if you follow me, more eccentric.
Yes.
And so Pluto's orbit goes out a little bit, but this thing goes way out there, 5 times further away at some points as it is at other points in its orbit. That would make it, if we want to call this a planet, even though it's got a comet-like orbit and is the size of our moon, okay, even if we want to call this a planet, that would make it the most eccentric planet in the solar system. The next most eccentric is Mercury. Now, Mercury has an orbit that goes from 27 million miles to 43 million miles, which is about roughly a 1 to 1.5 ratio. This is a 1 to 5 ratio. So you can see it's much more eccentric in its orbit than Mercury is. So it's a very different object from any that we know of. Mercury is about 3,100 miles in diameter, and this object, as I say, is around 2,300. The exact size is still up in the air. They're kind of guessing around, but that's an estimate that they're going with at the moment. And I think they've nicknamed it Lila temporarily. Lila, yeah. Now, that may be short for Lilith, and who knows what they're actually going to end up calling it. And they've come up with some really weird names for objects outside of Neptune's orbit. And so beware, it could end up being called almost anything. Now, it is tilted at the plane of the other planets about 15 degrees, according to what I've seen, and that means that it's not likely to hit anything. Because when you're tilted like that, you have a tendency to, come into the solar system at one point. Whereas if you're in the same plane as the other planets, you're always on a collision path with something if you cross its orbit. But here it's just kind of puncturing the plane of the orbits of the planets and only out where Neptune is. So the likelihood of it hitting anything is pretty small. On the other hand, this is a dangerous precedent, because what we're looking at is an object that comes into the field of the planets, even though its ability to hit anything is zero. I mean, it really can't hit anything, because when it is where Neptune's orbit is, it's actually way up above the plane of the solar system. So it's nowhere near Neptune's orbit, even though it's that far from the sun. I don't know if this makes any sense. You kind of have to see it to understand. But its orbit is tilted so that as it goes around the sun, it comes in and then goes way up above Neptune's orbit. So there's no likelihood of it running into Neptune. But nevertheless, they're calling this the 10th planet. Now, I kind of think that what happened here is that somebody panicked. Apparently there was a European team that had discovered an object that was about, I think, 1,600 miles in diameter. Now that's interesting. That places it just below the size of the major moons of the solar system, which run roughly from about 1,900 up to about 3,300 miles in diameter. So moons like Ganymede, Europa, Callisto, and Io of Jupiter, Titan of Saturn, and Triton of Neptune. Those are the major moons, and of course our moon. Those are the largest moons of the solar system, and there are 7 of them that fall into that category. And they range in size from Pluto, which is about 2,000 miles in diameter, on up to the size of Mercury, which is about 3,100. So they're all in that general vicinity, and they actually cluster around one or the other. So that, for example, Callisto, Ganymede, Titan, and Triton, and are all the size of Mercury. And Europa, Io, and Pluto, and this new object that they are calling the 10th planet, Lila, or whatever she is, are all the size of our moon, within a couple hundred miles. So it looks as though there's certain size areas, or size, what do we call them, ranges, that these objects fall into. And if you're in that particular size range, you tend to cluster there for some reason. And then there's another group that clusters around the 3,000, the 2,000 mile size, the 3,000 mile size. Mars is up at the 4,000 mile size. And then there's a jump to the 8,000 mile size where Venus and the Earth are. And then, the next step up, we don't know for sure because that would be the cores of the outer four planets. Since we can't see those cores, we can only guess at them. We don't really know at the moment what the solid cores, if any, of the outer planets are in terms of size. But you get the rough idea here of what we're dealing with. So when we look at this little object that they're calling the 10th planet that's in the cometary orbit tilted at 15 degrees to the solar system, I have a funny feeling that this claim that this is a planet was prompted by the fact that the French had announced this other object that is out there also in a somewhat planetary orbit that's about 1,600 miles in diameter. They looked at that and they said, gee, that's almost as big as Pluto, and ours is just a little bit bigger than Pluto. Maybe we better rush out there with our discovery that we've been waiting on for 2 years and claim that it's the 10th planet before the French claim that their object is the 10th planet. So this was a race that the French didn't even know they were in, kind of like one of those bicycle races. And all of a sudden, they got lanced by not Armstrong, but JPL.
Yeah.
And so we're now being told that, that this is the 10th planet. I'm not buying that it is the 10th planet, but I'm just saying to you that this is what they're saying. Since it's bigger than Pluto and comes within the general range where the planets come, unlike Sedna, which is like, 10,000 billion, trillion, quadrillion cubic millimeters out there or something. It's so far away that it makes Pluto look like our next door neighbor. That's how far Sedna is. But Sedna could be as big as Mars, which would make it a genuine planet in terms of size. So we're running into problems here in terms of what do you define a planet as being. Back in 1930, when Hage.Typhon discovered the planet Pluto, he thought it was bigger than Mercury. So he was looking for 3,500, maybe 4,000 miles, somewhere between Mercury and Mars for the size of Pluto. It turned out to be about half that size. So, and of course the mass was far smaller. So all of the original orbital predictions for Pluto were off. They didn't have a clue what they were dealing with. So when they called Pluto a planet, they thought it was bigger, they thought it was more circular, they thought the orbit was shorter. In other words, everything was different. Now they've got a whole new attitude toward Pluto. It looks like it's a pair of ice balls with its moon, Charon. And so...
boy, that sure does play havoc with a lot of these astrologers.
Yeah, well, that's true. The astrologers who back in the 30s and 40s were trying to include Pluto were including it in the wrong locations much of the time.
Sure.
And so, because its orbit wasn't quite what was being predicted, but it was moving so slowly that for all intents and purposes it probably didn't make a whole lot of difference. But its mass is tiny compared to what it was thought to be. The mass of Pluto is probably 1/80th of what Hage.Typhon was hoping for. So it's a fraction of what he had imagined it to be. And, of course, now JPL's saying, well, we got the 10th planet, but they don't know exactly what the size is. Not sure.
Yeah.
Guessing, claiming that it's larger than Pluto. That's how they're claiming that it's the 10th planet. That's the basic little thread they're clinging to, although where NASA's involved, they must clip that off because it's unsightly. But nevertheless, you can see here what the problem is, that we shouldn't have called Pluto a planet to start with. It's really just a member of the Kuiper belt, and now it is crystal clear that the Kuiper belt of objects out beyond Neptune is filled with Pluto-type objects, that is, objects anywhere from 1 to 2,000 miles in diameter, that are basically big balls of ice and kind of giant comets.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, these objects really shouldn't be classified as planets. And there are a lot of people now who are saying that. Brian Marsden, a lot of other guys in the field of planetary astronomy are coming to conclude that Pluto isn't a planet, and certainly if Pluto isn't, neither is Lila, or whatever this thing should be called, 2003 UB 313. So the question really becomes, what are we going to do now with Zechariah Sitchin and Nancy Lieder? Because they keep telling us that these objects are the objects that they predicted, and then suddenly we discover, no, they aren't.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, this new object cannot be either the Nancy Lieder or Zechariah Sitchin object because it's much too small. The object they're talking about is somewhere on the scale of Uranus or Neptune. It's a big object. And the Earth is about 8,000 miles in diameter. They're saying 4 times the size. I don't know if that's 4 times the mass or 4 times the diameter. You can't tell because they don't clarify it very well for you. But they're talking about something pretty large. And somewhere between, I suppose, Neptune and Uranus on one side and, say, Saturn on the other side. So it's a fairly large object, whatever it is, if it exists. But it certainly doesn't fit the description of this Planet X that was discovered in July of 2005, Lila, or whatever it is. Now, there's a problem, however. The presence of these objects out there, if you go to Zechariah Sitchin's writings and you read what he actually said, and remember Nancy Lieder's kind of writing on his coattails. I don't want to say tail because she's talking to reptilians, so you've got to be careful. But she's writing on his coattails. And what Zechariah Sitchin said was this. He said that the aliens counted the planets from the outside in, and that the Earth was the 7th planet. So, if we're 7, then Mars is 6, Jupiter is 5, Saturn is 4, Uranus is 3, Neptune is 2, and Pluto would be 1. Now, and that's the way he counted, okay? And he said they were counting the planets as they came in. And those were the planets that they passed, and that's how he reckons it. Of course, he also says there was a planet where the asteroid belt now is, called, I think, Titan or something, and it collided with Titan, or somebody did, and that's why it's now a wreck, of asteroids. So if you take all of his claims and you try to put them together with these new discoveries, you have a problem, because here's a couple of objects, Sedna and now Lila, that are both larger than Pluto. So why would the Nibiruans, all these people, why would these Anunnaki, as he calls them, why would they, or fallen ones, if you want to translate it, the Nephilim, why would these guys ignore larger objects than Pluto and count Pluto? Does that make any sense? I don't know. It doesn't sound like it to me. And so I think what we've got here is enough evidence that we can now say that Zechariah Sitchin's interpretation of the ancient Sumerian tablets, not that he actually looks at those. Does anybody really understand that he's reading these out of books? I got some of the same books he's using. I mean, I've looked at his footnotes. I've got some of those books,
Yeah, Noah Kramer did a lot of real good work on that.
I do not agree, but that's a matter of opinion.
Yeah.
He did not begin at Sumer. History may have ended.
Well, I mean, some of the things he wrote, I think, were pretty good, but the interpretations I'm with you. I don't agree.
Yeah, well, what was dug up is fact. What people say it means is often nonsense, and that's, of course, what we're dealing with Sitchin and Leader and a lot of these other people who come out and make these absurd claims about, what the tablets are saying. Now, the Nibiru is mentioned 9 times in the Sumerian tablets. 9. Okay, you can count them on your fingers, and you got 1 finger left over for Sedna. You know what I'm saying here? You got 9 mentions, and 8 of the 9 times it's identified with the planet Jupiter, and the 9th time it's identified with the planet Mercury. According to the Greeks and the Romans, Mercury was the messenger of Jupiter. So you can see why the Sumerians had that identification. I mean, it makes perfect sense. And very likely they were referring to one or the other here. And, of course, those are known planets, and not a 10th planet, not an extra planet, not another planet, but the known planets that are out there. And this is something that Sumerian scholars, people who actually read the tablets themselves, unlike Zechariah Sitchin, are very confident about. And yet here is Sitchin making this claim that, well, it refers to some planet that's 4 times the size of the Earth, and so on and so forth. And, where does he get all of this stuff from? Well, I know where he got it from, and I know how he made his mistake, and I think I understand the whole background of this blunder and where all of this nonsense came from. I started reading Sitchin's books back in 1975 when The 12th Planet was published by Avon Books, and ever since then I've collected all of his literature, as Billy Graham would say, and I have, I think, an almost complete collection of Sitchin. There may be some essay he wrote somewhere that I don't have, but I think I got all of the books that he's authored. And the most recent one is called The Lost Book of Enki. I believe that's the most recent now. And that's actually a novel, folks. Some people are actually quoting from this as if it's another so-called nonfiction work of Sitchin.
Yeah, they people were running around doing that with that, whatchamacallit code.
Oh, the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, Da Vinci
Other
Code.
issues. But this is where Sitchin has written a book that he says is his imagination of what the Book of Enki, if we had it, if it had been written, if it existed, what it might be like and what it might say. Okay, but apparently nobody reads his introduction. They just skip that, and they go ahead and they read the Lost Book of Enki as if it's an actual, factual, ancient document. And there are people writing books. There was a guy on Coast to Coast AM not too long ago who'd written a book about the ancient world and the Sumerians and so forth, and he was basing a lot of his factual support and evidence upon the Lost Book of Enki. It's fiction. It's not real. It's amazing how flimsy the support for all of this is. But anyway, when we get into part 2, I'm going to explain where I think Sitchin got his inspiration from. Actually, he tells us, but I'll go into what that is and show why it isn't what he thinks it is. And go into a little more of this planet counting business because, what Sitchin is saying is that there was another planet, Titan, between Earth and Pluto, that is to say, between Mars and Jupiter. But if you're counting from Pluto inward to the Earth, then if we're going to be number 7, then you got to count Titan, which means you don't count Pluto at all. So why does Sitchin say they did count Pluto if they didn't count Pluto? And what happened to Lila and what happened to Sedna and heaven knows how many other objects out there. So, it's a mess, basically. His whole thesis is based upon the assumption that there were only certain objects out there, and now we're finding that there's a bunch of other objects out there that, according to Sitchin's thesis, shouldn't be there because the aliens, the Anunnaki, should have seen those other objects. And then you might want to answer this question. why is our moon counted as one of the 12 planets when they didn't count the much larger objects of Callisto and Ganymede and Titan and Triton, large moons of some of the outer planets that are bigger than our moon? Why not count them, but count ours? You see how messy this all gets?
Yeah.
Yeah, it starts to fall apart when you think about it. But there's a reason for the mess. It's because it's all based upon the false interpretation of a single cylinder seal. And that's where it all begins. That's where all of this mythology begins. There is no tablet that actually says any of the things that Sitchin's talking about here in terms of these objects and their sizes, count, and so forth. That's not in the tablets. That's on a cylinder seal, but it's not really on the cylinder seal. And we'll describe that in part 2.
All right, folks, we'll be right back. Don't go away. Wow, short pause. Okay, we're back, and we're talking with Olaf Hage. We're talking about the 10th planet, Zachariah Sitchin, and other interesting topics. Olaf?
Yeah, I was talking about how Sitchin got started on all of this and where all of these things originate, where all of this comes from. It all began once upon a time, many years ago, back in the early 70s, when Zachariah Sitchin was looking at a cylinder seal that showed, from ancient Sumer, that showed what was considered a Nephilim or an Anunnaki, a giant or something, seated to the right. And of course, you know, you roll a cylinder seal out, it's a mirror image. But when you see the impression on our right as we look at it, there's a guy sitting. He's a big guy, big tall guy. He's facing to our left, okay? And there's a couple of people kind of bowing down in front of him, but you can see that their stature is kind of smaller. So Sitchin looked at this and he says, okay, this is an Anunnaki, and here are some Sumerians who are worshiping this guy or honoring him.
Yeah.
And then there's a tree. And beyond the tree, behind the tree, there's a mountain range. And remember, it's a cylinder seal, so, you know, this isn't like full-color DVD widescreen 16:9 ratio here. We're looking at something carved to leave an impression in clay.
Yeah.
So there's a mountain range in the background. And then above the mountain range, in the sky, beyond the tree, are some stars.
Mm-hmm.
And the stars include the following. There is a very large star that has some bright rays coming out of it. And then there are several other smaller stars around it. But those stars are basically just round impressions in the clay. They are of various sizes, some larger, some smaller, scattered basically around the bright star in the middle. And they're all around that star. In other words, on all sides of it. Now, if that's the sun, and if the sun is in the sky, and it's above the horizon, how many of those stars can you see?
Okay, I give.
The answer is 0.
Okay.
Unless there's a total eclipse of the sun. In which case, the moon, our moon, is in front of the sun. So that the circle for the sun, with the rays coming out of it, if that is the sun, would be eclipsed by the moon. And so you can't count the moon as being one of the other objects. Right?
Okay.
Right? And the mountain range below this group of stars is what we call the planet Earth, presumably. So you can't count the Earth as one of these objects. Now, once you recognize that problem, you have, in this cluster, you have 12 objects, one of which would have to be, if it's the sun, would have to be eclipsed by the moon. So there's actually 13 objects there, plus the Earth makes 14. Now, how do you get the 12th planet out of that? Well, you subtract the sun and the moon, right? And then you have 12 planets. The trouble is, of course, that the Earth is one of them, and you have 11 other planets. But we only know of 8 other planets. Now, if you look out there, you see, well, okay, we've got this new planet Lila, and we've got Senda out there, so you can make that 9 and 10. And then, of course, you'd make Nibiru 11, and then you would have Zechariah Sitchin's theory, right?
Okay.
But there's a little bit of a problem here. That isn't Zechariah Sitchin's theory. Zechariah Sitchin's theory is that the Earth and its moon are 2 of the 11 objects surrounding the sun-like object in the middle. So I have a problem with this because the cylinder seal is clearly showing us a scene. There's some guys in front of the king who is an Anunnaki, who's a giant. He's 9 feet tall. They're 6 feet tall. They're waving some palm branches, I believe. I haven't got it right in front of me at the moment, but I think they're honoring him with something. The tree is accurately represented. The mountains are accurately represented. Everything here is realistically presented in terms of what we understand of Sumerian claims about what this scene is supposed to show, except supposedly for the objects in the sky. Mm-hmm. And so the question becomes, why would they represent everything else on the cylinder seal in a fairly realistic manner, and yet display the stars in the background in a highly symbolic and unrealistic way? According to Zechariah Sitchin, the reason they're scattered around the central object is because they're trying to show that they're orbiting it. Well, clearly some of the other objects don't make any sense here because, for example, Jupiter is way below its proportionate size. And Jupiter has several moons, 4 moons surrounding it that are just as big as our moon or larger. And in fact, a couple of them are bigger than Mercury.
Olaf, do you think that that these Anunnaki or Anakim or whatever, that they actually had, or I should say inherited, real knowledge of?
Yeah, I think the fallen angels knew stuff, and I think they probably told things to the Sumerians. I mean, so far so good. That's recounted in the Book of Enoch. It's mentioned in the Lost Book of Adam and Eve. It's mentioned in a lot of ancient writings, Christian, Jewish, apocryphal writings, and pseudepigraphal writings, and so forth. It's not a secret. Okay. Zechariah Sitchin didn't discover that. It's stated openly in those books. But the question is, does this cylinder seal depict the planet Nibiru as the planet of the Anunnaki? And the answer to that question is no. And are the sizes on here proportionate to the planets and the sun, the moon, and so forth? And the answer is no. They're nowhere near proportionate. So he says, well, okay, it's a rough estimate as to what things are larger or smaller, even though the proportions aren't right. Well, all right. I mean, that's conceivable that the Sumerians knew a little bit, but they didn't know a whole lot. But what they were told doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, if you're going to tell them about Pluto, which according to Sitchin is one of those dots, then why are you going to leave out the moon of Pluto, which is half the size of Pluto, at least in diameter? Why are you going to leave out the moon of Neptune, which is larger than Mercury, or about the size of Mercury? In other words, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to include our moon, which is smaller than 4 of these other moons that are out there, which are as big as Mercury or bigger.
Well, it sold a lot of books, huh?
Well, yeah. If I make up a story like like the Da Vinci Code or the Lost Book of Enki or something else equally fictitious, and if I want to, I can say controversial things and I can sell a lot of books. But the problem is that there's a difference between claiming that you're doing a nonfiction historical work of some reference value,
right,
which is what Sitchin was claiming in The 12th Planet and in Stairway to Heaven and The Wars of Gods and Men and so on and so forth, and The Cosmic Code and other books that he wrote. If when you do what he's done and then you say things that just basically aren't true and are based upon your wishful thinking. Look, the 12th planet, I just showed you how you can count and get 14 out of that same diagram. Okay? It's Sitchin's opinion. Nothing else. There is no statement anywhere that there are 12 planets. It's only by Sitchin looking at this cylinder seal, only this cylinder seal, that he arrives at this idea that there are 12 planets. But he's saying that 2 of them are the sun and the moon. So why that should be, I don't know, but that's what he's saying. And, you could just as easily interpret this totally differently. And I just gave an illustration of how you could do it in a totally different way, come up with 14 instead of 12, remove the sun and the moon from the whole count. In other words, there are other ways to interpret that. But there's even one more way to interpret it. I like to go out walking at sunset, to see the sunset also gives me a chance to see any bright stars that are coming up and things of that sort. I've been an amateur astronomer since I was about 12 years old. I got my first telescope and started watching the heavens, looking at the moons of Jupiter, when I was a teenager and so forth. And I have to tell you that all these years of following this subject, and I've been interested in Planet X, the scientific Planet X, the 10th planet concept, since the 1960s. And I've talked to some of the scientists who are working on the problem and so forth. And I understand what the difficulties are. But these people, they're just guessing. They're just engaged in wishful thinking. They're not doing any real scientific investigation here. Dr. Edward Harrison, who I talked to from MIT, he had looked into the question on the basis of pulsars and looking at pulsars in terms of those that were accelerating in their winding down. Pulsars are slowly slowing down from their original wind-up speed, lose energy. And some of them are actually going up, which they shouldn't be doing, but that's an illusion created by our motion toward them or away from them. In other words, there's a kind of a Doppler effect that explains that. However, that motion is not explained by our motion around, that is our solar system's motion around the galaxy, and weaving in and out of the spiral arms of the galaxy. And so he proposed that there was another object out there that was attracting us, and it was causing us to move in its direction. So he wasn't sure whether it was a giant planet or perhaps a brown dwarf or some other object out there. And since he didn't make it clear in his article, I called him up and I asked him. I said, "Well, is it possible that it could be a black hole or a neutron star?" And he said, "Well," he says, "anything's possible." He says, "All I'm saying is that we're being drawn in that direction. There's something out there, something pulling us in that direction." Now that's a scientific study. That's that's a credible scientist at MIT. It's a real guy with real science. Of course, I talked to him back in the 70s. I don't know if Dr. Harrison's still alive or not. But the point is, it was real science. Do you think Nancy Leader even mentions this? Is he even aware of it? Do you think Zechariah Sitchin mentions this guy's work? No. They don't even know about it. Yet they could use his work to support their thesis. They don't bother to do any scientific investigation that would allow them to utilize scientific discoveries because they're not interested in facts. They're interested in promoting their own theories. There's a difference.
Yeah, I'd say there is.
Harrison's interested in finding out what's going on and reporting the facts that he's discovered. These guys are interested just in promoting their own theories, and they don't care about the facts. So we've got all kinds of objects being found out in the Kuiper Belt, and they don't really line up and match up with anything that fiction or leader have said. And therefore, the question becomes, well, what does? In other words, what does this cylinder seal, which is the basis of all of this stuff? It's all based upon this one cylinder seal and these little circles, these little dots that are interpreted, and by the way, they're incredibly tiny when you see them in real life size, that are being interpreted by Zecharia Sitchin, and then the existence of this planet is the basis for Nancy Lieder's predictions. He gets Nibiru, that is to say, he gets his Nibiru, not from Jupiter or Mercury like the scholars do. He gets his from the cylinder seal, and by the process of his elimination of the dots, arriving at one leftover dot that's very large, which he says, oh, look how much bigger that is than the dot I think is Earth. That is, that fiction thinks is Earth, and he looks at that and he says, oh, well, that's the 12th planet. That's Nibiru. Now, there's nothing on the cylinder seal that says that any of these things are planets. There's nothing on the cylinder seal that identifies any of these objects with any specific planet, or the moon, or the sun, or anything else. They're just dots in the sky, over a hill, behind a tree, behind a couple of guys standing in front of what appears to be a giant seated on a throne. And when you think about it, this is far background material. I mean, these little dots are way in the background of the scene. So when you see the proportionate to the whole cylinder seal, you realize that they could be stars, not planets, and that the size could be an indicator of the relative brightness of them.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that got me to thinking. You see, like I say, I like to walk at sunset. I go out walking and looking at the stars and things. And one night, a few years ago, I was walking home, and Jupiter at the time was in the sign of Orion, and it was in that vicinity. And as I was walking home, it was passing, I guess, just to the north of Orion, which would put it basically between Taurus and Gemini and Orion, right in the midst of those. Okay. Now, as I looked up at the sky, it was on the horizon. It was just above the distant trees and hills, very similar to the setting on the cylinder seal. And it formed a cluster of bright first magnitude stars: Betelgeuse, Rigel, Bellatrix, Casper, Pollux, and Aldebaran, and so forth. So you had some bright stars all around Jupiter, which was in the middle. But Jupiter, because it was low on the horizon and well situated, was extremely brilliant. And I looked at that and I said, wow, look at that. Jupiter outshines by far all those first magnitude stars it's sitting in the midst of. And at that moment, I suddenly remembered the cylinder seal. And I realized I was looking at almost exactly the same image that's on the cylinder seal, the same sizes, the same basic proportions, the same scene with the tree and the horizon in the distance. And I looked at that and I said, oh my gosh. Jupiter was on the cusp between Gemini and Taurus. Now, so what?
Yeah.
I'll tell you so what. At the time the cylinder seal was made, that was the beginning of the zodiacal year. That was the beginning of springtime. That was their year's start. And so here was Jupiter, point of the beginning of its cycle around the heavens, which took 12 years. It takes 12 years for Jupiter to go all the way around the heavens. So here they were commemorating, apparently, somebody's rule, somebody's reign. Think about what a cylinder seal is. It's what a king uses to impress in clay after he puts the clay over a document and says, okay, this is my official seal now, and I am giving my official approval as King so-and-so over this document. So what is the artist, the sculptor, whoever it was who made the cylinder seal, what is that person basically saying? They're saying that when this king was ready to start reigning, he needed a cylinder seal so that he could sign his documents. And lo and behold, as he started his reign, I look up in the sky, and there was this brilliant Jupiter, the king planet, the brightest of all the planets next to Venus, of course, but the brightest of the planets in terms of a planet that actually goes 1 year for each side of the zodiac. It's like the great timekeeper of the heavens, okay? It's the king planet. The planet of kings is located right at the beginning of the zodiac, as it was in those days, because precession of equinoxes, that's where it began in those days. So they looked up in the sky, and there was Jupiter right at the beginning of their year, based upon where precession was at the time the cylinder seal was made. So all they're doing is saying, oh, look at this good omen. Jupiter, the planet of kings, is at the beginning of the year. What an appropriate moment to make a cylinder seal for the king. So he puts that in the background to signify, in effect, a date. Not a 12th planet, not Nibiru, but a date. And you think about it, what is the cylinder seal showing you? That it's that year of the king's reign. It's telling you what time it is. And they may have made a cylinder seal like this for this guy every year. And, each year there's a different group of stars, and there was Jupiter with a different background. I mean, who knows? But this is a very straightforward, simple interpretation. Now, you go to ancient Egypt. They had a celebration that they put on every, I think it was 30 years. And if you look at what happened every 30 years in Egypt, you discover what the significance was. The planet Saturn makes a complete circle of the heavens every 30 years. So it comes back to its starting point in the sky every 30 years. So, which happens to mirror a human generation of 30 years. Okay? So, in ancient Egypt, they celebrated the reign of the king every 30 years, and that was a Saturn cycle. I believe that these ancient civilizations, and remember, ancient Egypt and ancient Sumer were contemporaneous at about that time. I believe that what they were doing is they were looking up in the sky, they were looking at these orbits of Jupiter and Saturn and other planets, and they were using them as timekeepers for longer periods of time than a single year. So they had a 12-year cycle with Jupiter and a 30-year cycle with Saturn. And if they wanted to honor a king like this, I mean, putting a Jupiter sighting on a cylinder seal was a way to say, may the king live another 12 years and reign another 12 years of prosperity. The heavens are giving an omen that this king will reign for another 12 years. So, it was the kind of thing that they did. They read omens in the stars. They interpreted them in favorable or unfavorable ways for the kings and the rulers. And, this cylinder seal is clearly reflecting some sort of omen interpretation related to what appears to be, if my observations, a couple of years back are correct, of a passage of Jupiter through the cusp of Taurus and Gemini. which, as I say, is about where the precession of the equinoxes put the start of the year, back when that cylinder seal was made.
You know, Olaf, is it true? I mean, Nibiru, isn't that another word for Mercury, the planet Mercury?
Yeah, I believe it is, because the word actually means prophet planet or prophet star or prophetic planet. And that really fits Mercury. Mercury was the messenger of Jupiter, or if you will, Hermes was the messenger of Zeus in the Greek version of it. I forget the name of it. Adad was the messenger of Marduk in the Babylonian version, and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, each of these names has a meaning, and you can interpret that meaning. And in this case, Nebi means prophet, and Uru means light or star, and so it means prophet star. And the planet Mercury was considered the planet of prophecy, as was Hermes, the Greek version.
Right.
So, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And if you look, for example, at the Hebrew version, they made Raphael the angel of Mercury, and he was also considered an angel of prophecy. So you go to the Egyptian version, it was Thoth, and the same thing was true there. So it's not unusual for these ancient cultures to have basically the same interpretation. And so we can tell just from the name Nibiru that they were talking about the planet Mercury. Mm-hmm. And again, it's clearly identified as Mercury on one of the 9 tablets where it's mentioned. And in the other 8, it's representing Jupiter. But in those cases, well, Mercury always represents Jupiter, so that doesn't really mean anything different.
Goodness. Well, why don't you give out your information, Olaf, on the tapes that you produce, because they are really wonderful.
Okay, well, there are hundreds of tapes.
Yes.
An hour or an hour and a half long. There are actually tapes of these broadcasts. There are tapes of, when I'm on. There are tapes of, and this one, by the way, will be known as TBS-12. And I have a very simple system. I sell the 1-hour tapes for $10 and the 90-minute tapes for $12. There's $4 shipping and handling for the first tape, and any additional tapes, the shipping and handling is free for the second, third, fourth, or whatever. So you just pay the shipping and handling once. And people can email me, and I can send them a link to the website. They can email me at petragrail@yahoo.com, and I'll spell Petra Grail, it's all one word. T as in Paul, E-T as in Tom, R-A, and Grail, just like Holy Grail, G-R-A-I-L. And that's at yahoo.com. Of course, people know Yahoo. The website is theTimeQuest.com, and The Time Quest is all one word, TheTimeQuest.com, TheTimeQuest.com. Just think of somebody looking for a watch. Yeah, down the rabbit hole. And I have what we call a $100 a month club, where everything I produce each month, which is about 10 hours worth of tapes and a research report that runs about 20 pages with full color illustrations, if possible, paintings or whatever it is, produced each month. So we produce a lot of material each month, and you can save some money in the $100 a month club if somebody gets interested in all of it. We have about 50 pages up on the website on a lot of topics, including things related to planets and prophecy and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So there's an awful lot of material up there. I do basically apologetics. I go looking for those topics where people are attacking the Bible or misrepresenting church history or whatever, and I try to address those.
Well, there's a lot of persuasion that have been going on now for decades to persuade people away from faith in Jesus Christ, away from studying the Christian Bible.
Oh, yeah, they want to scare you away from it.
Well, they want to put it in people's minds that, there are more important things to study, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, the Da Vinci Code isn't one of them. I have an
Right.
article on the Da Vinci Code up there, and if they will go to my that homepage there and look at the top left, there is a link to the Da Vinci Code article. It's complete with footnotes and references and stuff. Not footnotes, but the references are actually in the text. I don't like to have people look down at the bottom and then look back up the text back and forth all the time. So I stick them right there in the text so you can find
Good.
it. And so there's a nice in-depth article on the Da Vinci Code and some of the false statements that it makes about the Bible and about church history. And my goodness, we got an article up there on Bible codes and why some of them are phony and some of them are not. Article on Mars in 2012. Articles on Cain and Lilith. Oh my goodness, the Council of Nicaea.
Oh, it's huge. It's a huge website.
Yep.
And people can spend years doing research on your website. Olaf, we're right up against the end of this hour of the show. God bless you. Thank you so much for coming on. And
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.
Joy, anytime, and talking about this topic. This is for Jen Hughes with my very special guest, Olaf Hage. Be sure and go have a look at his website and be prepared to take notes. We'll be back soon, folks, and take care of yourselves out there. The world is getting weirder by the day, isn't it, Olaf?
Absolutely.
Okay. Good night, everybody, and God bless you, and thank you for listening.